join me for a moment of prayer? Loving God who has created us and sustains us day by day, we come with thanksgiving for these moments when we can ease the pace of our lives and listen for your voice. Create a spirit within us that truly draws us toward you and toward all our brothers and sisters. A spirit deep, receptive, gentle, and bold. Clear our minds, open our hearts, and touch us with your presence and power. For we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. I was visiting the Bristol Rotary Club a few weeks ago when they had their changeover event, which is that time in the life of Rotary when we give thanks for the leadership who's guided the club in the past, and we welcome in the new team of people who will be leading us into the new year. And they did something unusual, a little bit unusual this year for their changeover. They decided to have a picnic down in Kelly Park. And it was great. It was a great day, sort of just like this one. And we got to listen in on the band that was there for the show later on in the pavilion. It was just a great evening. Now, for those of you who know Bristol maybe a little bit, and I happened to do a 3-month term in the church there while their pastor was on sabbatical last summer. So I got to know it pretty well. And one of the things Bristol does not have is good cell service. In fact, the one place often in that town you can get connection is in the church parking lot. So throughout the day, sometimes you'd see people drive up there and park in the church parking lot because you knew they were on some device. Because there they might be able to get a bar or two. But what really made me think of this is when we were at the picnic down in the park. And, you know, there were people kind of wandering around. They may have been the family members that have come in for summer visit or just people new to the town. You know, they were doing this kind of thing. You know, you see any bars? Bars, anybody? You know? And it reminded me, of course, because, you know, I think I'm in good company here, of that Verizon commercial some years ago. Yeah, we're already there. Where that guy's wandering around with the phone on his ear saying, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" And I've often wondered if this is kind of the bottom line for us when it comes to our time of prayer. Lord, can you hear me now? Do we have a connection? If Jesus' disciples were experiencing something of that in their own lives, after being on the road with him now for almost 3 years and seeing him in ministry, they were probably convinced that Jesus did not have that kind of experience. No matter where they were, whether it was morning or nighttime, Jesus seemed to have an ongoing connection with the God he called Father. And he demonstrated that in his life to them constantly. At this point in Luke's gospel, Jesus has, as Luke says, set his face to go to Jerusalem. And so I sense perhaps that the disciples realize things are coming maybe to a head as we get closer and closer. Time is running out, making this perhaps the right moment to finally get around to saying to him probably what they wanted to say for a while. You know, and one of them is bold enough to come up and say, "Lord, teach us to pray like John did his disciples." And I don't think this is them asking for some kind of special prayer that will set them apart from whatever prayer John's disciples are praying. It's not that kind of request, I don't think. I think it goes much deeper than that. Us first century Jews, these guys would have known how to basically pray. But after 3 years on the road, there is just something about this guy. Something about Jesus that was clearly the result of his prayer life, this time he had that gave him a deeper sense and connection with God. And they wanted that for themselves. I mean, who could blame them? What was it that they witnessed that motivated this one on behalf of everybody to come forward and ask Jesus that question? I agree with Matt Skinner in his commentary when he notes, I don't think they were trying to learn a technique like how to achieve proper balance among praise and confession, thanksgiving, and so on. Nor do I believe the intention was to get Jesus to institute a prayer that Christians could gather around and speak in unison whenever they met for worship. Although there's nothing inherently wrong with what we have done and do together in reciting the Lord's Prayer every Sunday. I think this unnamed disciple who puts himself forward to ask the question wanted to learn more about Jesus' love for God and his intense desire to see God's reign come in all its fullness to this world. Teach us to pray is about equivalent to show us your heart, or tell us what it's like to really be in communion with God. Don't turn, Matt says, to Jesus in Scripture for ruminations and techniques, models, and best practices. Go there to discover what love looks like. Love in action. Love for God. Love for neighbor. If we come to Jesus only to seek information or a pattern to follow, we can hardly experience all he has to offer us. Now, unlike the prayer, maybe you noticed this, that was the one Kurt read for us from Psalm 138. Did you notice the pronouns in that prayer from Psalm 138? I, me, my. And in the Lord's Prayer that Jesus shares with his disciples, he takes it into community, doesn't he? The pronouns there are our, we, us, reminding us that reconciliation is critical, not just in our personal lives, but in our life together as a community. That we are not alone as we face life's struggles and challenges. We have one another. That we do, in fact, bear one another's burdens and desire to be a people passionate about seeing God's kingdom come in all its fullness. The specific things, I think at least, that Jesus includes in this prayer are not meant to be a defining list of what our prayers ought to encompass. They are meant to engage our imaginative spirits, to open our hearts to the things that are on God's heart. That's where we need to make the connection. What does God desire? What does God want? And to make all of life the subject of this ongoing conversation. Praying this way actually results in a gospel-shaped way of life, a way of comprehending the world. The rules we live by are all of our relationships. The person we are at the church budget meeting. The person we are when we head to do a little advocacy at the microphone at the town selectmen. In these moments, we are showing people our hearts. We're sharing a passion for God and the promised reign of God, because that's what shapes who we are and what we care about. We're sharing describing a meaningful way of life as we've come to understand it as God's faithful people. We're fostering love for God and for neighbor by declaring the ways in which God has already begun to show us what steadfast love looks like when it gets played out in human life. What these disciples witnessed in Jesus was prayer and life coming together. And I think that is his desire for us. As somewhere along the road, Jesus also teaches us how to pray. Kate Huey tells a personal story which I think kind of captures the heart of perhaps Jesus' approach to his praying, and perhaps what he wants us, how he wants us to understand what prayer could be like for us when life and prayer meet together. Kate writes that every summer during her childhood, she, her brothers and sisters, her mom and dad, would all gather for a big family reunion which was hosted by her Aunt Emma. And they always held this family reunion at a city swimming pool. Now the problem was, unfortunately, Kate did not know how to swim. And she's sure that her cousin Maggie had only the best intention when Maggie suggested that perhaps what she could do is offer Kate her own private swimming lessons. Kate looked up to Maggie, of course, because Maggie was at that young age. She was 4 years older, and therefore, you know how that is. The sun rises and sets, and the older one who seems so mature and to know all things. So she was game. Lesson 1 in Maggie's teaching method was, Kate, you've got to get your head underwater. Well, as Kate said, this was a singularly unattractive idea. And so she resisted. So again, best intentions, just to be helpful. Maggie pushed, as you can imagine, Kate down under the water. And with every push, Kate, you know how it is. She was fighting against it. Her eyes were stinging. The pool water was going up her nose and burning. And it cut off her air of all important things. So needless to say, the lessons there that day in the pool were not a success. And for years afterwards, Kate had this kind of love-hate relationship with water. She said, I thought it would be wonderful to swim. And I used to dream I could do it. And yet every time I got in the water, I was tense and afraid of that burning and loss of air and the panic they produced. Well, then one day when she was pushing 40, she was at the pool with her young son, Doug. And Doug was about 10 years old at this time, and he could swim like a fish. Kate had done the smart thing. She had made sure that all of her kids got swimming lessons when they were really young, not from Cousin Maggie. So Doug, at this wonderful age of 10, just couldn't bear it any longer that his mom didn't know how to swim. And that day he was convinced, today's the day. We're going to get Mom to swim. So hanging on the side of the pool together, Doug, first in his lesson was, Mom, you've got to relax. If you draw a deep breath and totally relax in the water, it will hold you up. You'll float. Just trust me. Just trust me. And with that, he gently pushed off from the side of the pool and floated right there in front of Kate. In that moment, she says, that little guy with the big blue eyes cut right through years of fear and tension and fighting the water. Scrunching her eyes, Kate took a deep breath of air and eased out into the water. And lo and behold, she floated, just like Doug said she would. Could Jesus be simply inviting us through this prayer to push off from the side and to trust that we will float, that we will always be held up by the love that will never let us go, by the God who, as the story Jesus tells on the backside of sharing the prayer makes clear, a God who hears when we ask, when we knock, when we seek, a God who provides, a God who forgives, a God who protects, and a God who expects us to be generous with one another. I just think the disciples recognized that prayer shaped who Jesus was and what it compelled him to do day in and day out. And so they asked, Jesus, teach us to pray. Luke left this off, so that we can be like you. Are you ready to take a deep breath, to push off from the side out into the deep water, to trust and to float, for the Spirit to hold you up and keep you in every moment of your life? If you are, join with me in one deep breath. Amen. Those disciples into prayer, so that your Spirit slowly but surely perhaps could work on them to give them your heart and your mind, so that each and every day as they went out, just like you, they would have the eyes to see and ears to hear, hands to respond. Make us those kinds of disciples today, for we ask it in your holy name.